It wasn't supposed to be a long trip, just a weekend getaway. Something to break up the monotony of work and give me and my girlfriend Rachel a chance to relax. We had no real destination in mind, just a general direction and the plan to stop wherever we felt like. It was meant to be spontaneous, a break from our usual overplanned, overbooked routines. But that spontaneity, that decision to just drive and see where the road took us, is what landed us at the Evergreen Motel. I'll never forget the name, even though I wish I could. If I'd known what was waiting for us there, I would have kept driving. I would have kept going, no matter how tired we were. It was late when we pulled off the highway, sometime after midnight. We'd been driving all day, our original plan to camp somewhere, long abandoned when we realized we hadn't brought half the gear we needed. The sun had set hours ago, and after another stretch of empty road with no signs of life, we spotted the glowing neon sign, Evergreen Motel. It looked quaint. A little old-fashioned, sure, but not in a rundown, creepy way. Just dated. "Looks fine," Rachel had said, already yawning, her hand on my shoulder. "I'm too tired to be picky." I agreed, feeling the weight of exhaustion pulling at me too. So we pulled into the gravel parking lot, our headlights illuminating a few other cars scattered across the lot. The place wasn't empty, but it wasn't full either. There was just enough life to feel comfortable, to not feel like we were the only ones there. The motel itself was a single-story structure with about a dozen rooms, each with a door facing the parking lot. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it wasn't the worst place I'd stayed in. Outside the office, the clerk, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a worn-out expression, gave us the keys to room 7. He barely spoke. I remember thinking he looked tired, like someone who had been stuck in that place far too long. We made our way to the room. It was quiet. Even though there were other cars in the lot, it didn't feel like anyone else was around. No sounds of TVs from the other rooms, no muffled voices, just the distant hum of the neon sign and the faint buzz of insects in the summer night air. When we opened the door to the room, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there. A faint mustiness, like the place had been shut up too long. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean enough. At first glance, everything seemed fine. We set our bags down, too tired to care about the peeling wallpaper or the flickering bathroom light. After a quick shower, we both collapsed onto the bed, the exhaustion of the day catching up with us fast. For a while, we just lay there, the low murmur of the TV filling the room, the kind of mindless background noise that helps you unwind. "Maybe tomorrow we'll find a better place to stay," Rachel mumbled, her head resting on my chest. "Yeah, tomorrow," I agreed, but in that moment, I didn't care about tomorrow. I just wanted to sleep. But it didn't last. I woke up to the sound of soft creaking. At first, I thought it was the bed, or maybe Rachel shifting beside me, but the sound kept going, like footsteps moving slowly across the carpet. My mind groggy with sleep, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. A weird sense of unease creeping up my spine. Something was off. "Rachel?" I whispered. The creaking stopped. I turned my head to look at Rachel, expecting to see her asleep beside me, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light filtering in from the window. That's when I saw him. The clerk. He was standing at her side of the bed, hunched over, his face inches from Rachel's. His greasy hair hung down over his forehead as he leaned closer to her, his lips parting. For a second, I was frozen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. But then it hit me. He was trying to kiss her. Rage and terror surged through me in equal measure. I bolted upright, throwing the covers off me. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. Rachel jolted awake, her eyes wide with confusion as she sat up, her hands instinctively pulling the blanket closer to her chest. The clerk stumbled backward, his face twisting into something that almost looked like embarrassment, but there was something darker behind it, something that made my stomach turn. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes darting between me and Rachel, and for a moment I thought I was going to be sick. "Get out!" I yelled, my voice louder now, filled with more anger than fear. The clerk blinked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took a step toward the door, but he didn't move fast enough. He lingered for just a second too long, his gaze locked on Rachel before finally turning and shuffling out of the room. I slammed the door behind him, my hands shaking as I threw the deadbolt into place, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. What the hell had just happened? What was he doing in our room? Rachel was sitting up in bed, her face pale as she stared at the door. What the hell was that? She whispered. I don't know, I muttered, still trying to process what had just happened. He was in here. I don't know how, but he was in here. He was close to me, Rachel said. Like right next to me, I could feel him breathing. The thought made my skin crawl. I paced the room, trying to figure out what to do. Should we call the police? Should we leave? But where would we go at this time of night? The nearest town was miles away, and we didn't know anyone around here. And what if the clerk was still out there, watching us? I walked over to the window, carefully pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. The parking lot was empty, save for our car and the clerk's beat-up truck parked near the office. But there was no sign of him. We need to leave, Rachel said suddenly. I don't care where we go. We can't stay here. I nodded. She was right. We couldn't stay. I grabbed our bags, stuffing everything into them as quickly as I could. Rachel was already out of bed, throwing on her clothes with shaky hands. I kept looking at the door, expecting it to swing open again, expecting the clerk to come back in. His face twisted into that sickening smile. As soon as we were packed, we bolted. We just grabbed our stuff and ran to the car. We practically sprinted across the lot. I unlocked the doors and jumped inside. Rachel was already buckled in, her face pale, her hands trembling. Go, she urged, just go. I started the engine, and we peeled out of the parking lot. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was standing in the doorway, watching us leave. We drove for miles without saying a word. The road stretched out in front of us, dark and empty, the only sound, the low hum of the engine. My mind was racing, replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to make sense of it. What was he doing? Rachel finally whispered, her voice breaking the silence. Why was he in our room? I don't know, but he wasn't supposed to be there. At the time, we just wanted to forget it ever happened. We didn't talk about it much after that. Didn't even tell anyone when we got back home. It was like some unspoken agreement between us. We wouldn't bring it up, wouldn't think about it, but it still lingers. To this day, I can't stay in motels. I can't shake the memory of waking up to see that man leaning over Rachel, his lips too close to her face. I can't forget the way he looked at her like he was about to do something horrible, something I was just seconds away from stopping. And I'll never forget the way his eyes lingered on her as he left, as if he wasn't finished, as if he would have come back. I hadn't planned on staying at a motel that night. Honestly, I try to avoid them whenever possible. I'm not picky, but after years of traveling for work, you start to get a feel for which places are trouble just by looking at them. But that night, I didn't have much of a choice. I had been driving for hours, and it was getting late, later than I had expected. The highway was empty, the kind of empty that makes you feel like you're the last person left on Earth. I'd been fighting to keep my eyes open for the last half hour, and with no rest stop in sight, I figured pulling over at the next motel I saw was better than risking dozing off behind the wheel. So, when I spotted the flickering neon sign up ahead, motel, with a half-burnt-out vacancy sign beneath it, I pulled off the highway and made my way toward it. It wasn't exactly welcoming. Peeling paint, a couple of dim lights barely illuminating the parking lot, and weeds growing in patches along the cracked pavement. But like I said, I was out of options. I parked my car in front of the office, which looked more like a small shed than a reception area, and stepped out. The air was thick with humidity, and the place smelled like wet concrete and something faintly rotten. Maybe trash left out too long, or stagnant water somewhere nearby. I hesitated for a second, considering getting back in the car and driving a bit further. But my body was begging for sleep, and my vision had already started to blur from exhaustion. The inside of the office wasn't much better. The clerk, a balding man with a graying mustache, didn't bother looking up from his crossword puzzle when I walked in. He just muttered, "Room for the night?" without any of the usual pleasantries. I handed him cash. No way I was letting them have my credit card information, and he slid a rusted key across the counter without a word. "Room 12, he grunted. I thanked him, though he didn't seem to hear me, and stepped back outside. My room was at the far end of the lot, next to a row of similarly run-down doors. The parking lot was empty, except for one other car, a rusty old sedan parked near the middle of the row. It didn't look like anyone had driven it in weeks. The door to my room creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was exactly what you'd expect from a motel like this. A stained carpet, faded wallpaper peeling in the corners, and the faint, musty smell of something I couldn't quite place. The bed looked like it had seen better days, but at that point, I didn't care. I just needed sleep. I locked the door behind me, making sure the deadbolt was secure, and threw my bag down on the bed. The window next to the door had thin curtains that didn't fully cover the glass, but it was better than nothing. I drew them shut and tried to relax. I flipped on the old TV, mostly for background noise, and laid down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. But something felt off. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but the longer I laid there, the more the unease crept in. It wasn't just the crappy state of the room, it was something else. Something about the silence outside. It was too quiet. After about 15 minutes of tossing and turning, I sat up, frustrated. Maybe I was just on edge from the long drive. I looked at the window, expecting to see someone out there, but there was nothing. Just the faint glow of the parking lot light filtering through the thin curtains. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid and laid back down. That's when I heard the first noise. A light scratching sound, like something brushing against the outside of the door. I kept listening. It came again, this time a little louder. I sat up slowly, straining to hear through the muffled sounds of the old TV. There was definitely something out there. My heart started to race as I stared at the door. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe it was just the wind or some stray animal. But the more I listened, the more distinct the sound became. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet. I grabbed my phone and stood up, inching toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I debated whether or not to check. A voice inside was screaming at me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I leaned forward, peeking through the tiny peephole. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty parking lot. But then, movement caught my eye. Someone was standing just outside my door, slightly off to the side out of full view. I could only make out the edge of their shoulder, the glint of something shiny in their hand. Maybe keys, maybe something else. I backed away from the door, suddenly feeling vulnerable. Was this someone checking the doors? Seeing if they could get into one of the rooms without being noticed? I stood there in silence, not daring to move, barely breathing. The scratching sound started again, followed by the faint jiggle of the doorknob. They were trying to get in. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking. I wanted to call the front desk, but deep down, I knew it would be pointless. That old man at reception didn't seem like the type to care about anything happening in this place. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? There was someone at my door. Was that enough? Before I could make a decision, the jiggling stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement, but the quiet stretched on. For a brief moment, I thought maybe they had left. Maybe they'd realized the room was locked and moved on to an easier target. But then I heard it, a soft tap on the window. I whipped around, my eyes darting to the curtains. The thin fabric barely concealed the shape of the window, and through the gaps I saw a shadow moving. Someone was out there. Someone was looking in. I backed away from the window. How many were there? One person outside my door, another at the window? Or was it the same person? I finally dialed 911, my breath shaky as I whispered into the phone. There's someone outside my room. I think they're trying to break in. The operator's composed voice was a jarring contrast to the chaos inside me. She told me to stay on the line, asked for the motel's address, and assured me that police were on their way. But as I stood there waiting, I couldn't help but feel like it wasn't going to be enough. What if they got in before the cops arrived? I inched toward the bathroom, locking myself inside, hoping it would buy me some time. My heart raced as I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound from outside. An eternity seemed to stretch on with nothing, just silence. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were closer, right outside the window. I could hear the crunch of gravel beneath their feet, the creak of wood as they pressed against the side of the building. They were moving around, circling the room, testing the doors and windows. I gripped my phone tightly, my hands trembling as the operator continued to speak in my ear, asking if I was okay, if I could still hear them. But all I could do was listen to the footsteps. Finally, I heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sign that they were still out there. But there was nothing. No scratching, no tapping, no footsteps, just silence. When the police arrived, I cautiously stepped out of the bathroom and opened the door. They searched the area, but there was no one in sight. The parking lot was empty. I asked the officer if they had found anything, footprints, signs of forced entry, anything to explain what had happened, but they didn't find a thing. The motel clerk hadn't seen anything either. Probably just kids messing around, he said with a dismissive shrug, as if the whole thing was no big deal. But I knew better. There had been someone outside my door, someone trying to get in, and whether they were there to rob me or something worse, I had no doubt in my mind that I had been targeted that night. I keep thinking that if I hadn't called the police when I did, I might not have made it through the night. I haven't stayed in a motel since. I've always been cautious when traveling alone. It's not that I'm overly paranoid, it's just that being a woman on the road, you learn to be extra careful. Most of the time, nothing happens. Most of the time, I'm just another traveler, checking into a motel for a quick night's sleep before heading off in the morning. But this time, things were different. This time, I was watched, and I'm haunted by the thought that if I hadn't trusted my instincts, the night would have gone terribly wrong. Like all my previous work trips, it started off the same way. I was on my way to a client meeting in a town a few hours away, and after a long day of driving, I decided to stop at a motel just off the highway. It wasn't the nicest place, but I wasn't expecting much. As long as the bed was clean and the door locked, it would do for the night. The motel wasn't anything special. The kind of place you've probably seen 1,000 times while driving down empty highways. An old single-story building with a faded sign, a gravel parking lot, and a string of rooms with chipped paint and dim porch lights. There were a few other cars parked outside, but the place seemed pretty deserted. I parked my car near the office, checked in quickly with a disinterested clerk, and got my room key. Room 8. I grabbed my overnight bag from the back seat and made my way to the room, trying not to think about how late it was and how tired I felt. I just wanted to shower, unwind, and fall asleep. The room was, well, exactly what I expected. The carpet was worn, the curtains were thin, and the air smelled faintly of stale cigarettes. But it was quiet, and I could lock the door. That was enough. After unpacking, I decided to grab a quick snack from a vending machine outside before settling in for the night. It was late, the parking lot eerily still, but I didn't feel too uneasy, at least not yet. I was used to traveling alone, used to these kinds of motels, and honestly, I thought the worst thing I'd have to deal with was a noisy air conditioner, or maybe a bad shower. I was walking back to my room with a soda and some chips when I first saw him. He was standing a few rooms down, leaning against the wall. At first, I didn't think much of it. He could have been another guest, just out for a smoke or something. But as I passed by, I noticed that he wasn't smoking. He was just standing there. Our eyes met briefly, and I gave him a quick nod, a polite, "Hey, I see you're there," kind of nod. He didn't respond. He didn't smile or nod back. He just kept staring. Goosebumps prickled my skin, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was weird. Or maybe he wasn't even paying attention to me at all. I brushed it off, hurried back to my room, and locked the door behind me. I spent the next hour watching TV, trying to forget about the man outside. Every now and then, I found myself looking at the window, expecting to see him standing there, watching me from the other side of the glass. But there was nothing. Just the ugly curtains swaying slightly in the breeze from the air conditioner. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination get the better of me. I'd seen a guy in the parking lot, so what? There was no reason to think he was anything more than another traveler. Still, I couldn't relax. Eventually, I decided to shower and try to get some sleep. The hot water helped a little, easing some of the tension from my body. But when I stepped out and looked at the fogged-up mirror, I still felt that knot of unease in my stomach. I dried off, changed into my pajamas, and climbed into bed, turning off the TV and leaving only the lamp by the bed for light. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the soothing hum of the air conditioner or the soft glow of the lamp, my mind kept drifting back to that man. The way he had stood there, silent and still, staring at me. I hadn't seen him since, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound, almost like a light knock, coming from the window. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again. My heart leapt into my throat. I lay there, frozen, listening. It was coming from the window, just behind the curtain. Slowly, I sat up in bed, my eyes locked on the window, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a tree branch, it was deliberate. I slid out of bed and crept toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the curtains, I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the fabric. What if it was him? What if he was standing there, watching, waiting for me to look? I wanted to pull the curtain back to see for myself, but fear rooted me in place. Instead, I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on it as I reached for my phone. I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. The tension that had followed me from the parking lot was now a full-blown sense of dread, and I couldn't stop thinking that I wasn't alone. I dialed the front desk, hoping for some reassurance, but after 4 rings, no one picked up. Figures. This place wasn't exactly known for its customer service. I was about to try again when the tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the doorknob rattled. An intense panic seized me. I backed up further, clutching the phone to my chest. The knob rattled again, harder this time, like someone was testing it, trying to see if it would open. I couldn't breathe, every muscle in my body stiff with tension. I watched the door, waiting for it to burst open, waiting for whoever was on the other side to come crashing in. But the door held. The rattling stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, but eventually the silence returned. I slowly approached the door, pressing my ear against it, listening for any sound from the other side. Nothing. I reached for the peephole. I had to know. I had to see if he was still out there. I leaned in, peering through the tiny hole. The hallway was empty. No one was there. I let out a shaky breath, but just as I started to relax, I saw it. A shadow. It flickered at the edge of the hallway. My stomach lurched. He was still there, waiting. I stepped back from the door. I knew I couldn't stay here. He had tried the door once. He would try again, and next time I might not be so lucky. I grabbed my bag, throwing my things inside as quickly and quietly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip it shut, but I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't have time to waste. I had to get out. Once I had everything packed, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to do next. I couldn't stay locked in the room forever. I had to make it to my car. I had to leave. But that meant opening the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my heart racing. I knew he was still out there. I had seen the shadow, felt the weight of his presence just beyond the door. But I couldn't stay here. I had to take my chances. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, the faint click sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Slowly, I cracked the door open, just enough to peek through. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, every nerve in my body on high alert. The parking lot was just a few steps away. If I could make it to my car, I'd be safe. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs carried me forward, faster than I thought possible, my keys clutched tightly in my hand, the footsteps closing in behind me. I ran. My fingers fumbled with the keys, adrenaline surging through me as I reached my car. I threw open the door, practically diving inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Shaking, I jammed the key into the ignition and started the car. I looked up. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the glow of the streetlight. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the outline of him. His shoulders hunched, his eyes locked on me. I threw the car into reverse, speeding out of the lot without looking back. I never reported it. What would I even say? I hadn't seen his face. I didn't know his name. All I knew was that I had been watched, followed, and if I hadn't left when I did, I might not be telling this story right now. I still wonder who he was, what he wanted, and I'll never forget the way he watched me. I've always been a bit of a night owl, so late-night drives never bothered me. But that night, something felt different. Maybe it was the fact that I was passing through a part of the state I didn't know. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't have been out there. I was headed home after visiting some friends in a small town about 5 hours from where I live. They'd invited me to stay the night, but I declined, thinking I'd be fine driving back after dark. I'd done it 100 times before, so why not? The plan was simple. Drive until I got tired, then find a cheap motel to crash in for a few hours before finishing the trip in the morning. That's how I ended up at the Pine Creek Motel, a rundown place tucked away off the highway that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. It was one of those motels you only stop at if you're desperate. There was a small office at the front, the light inside dim and yellowed, like the whole place was stuck in some forgotten corner of time. I hesitated for a moment, fingers still gripping the steering wheel, wondering if I should keep driving. But the fatigue was starting to hit me hard, and I knew I couldn't make it another hour without some rest. Just a few hours, I muttered to myself, trying to block out the growing sense of unease in my stomach. I got out of the car and headed into the office. The clerk was an older man with thinning hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He didn't say much when I asked for a room, just handed me the key to room 6 with a gruff cash only and a quick glance up from the book he was reading. I handed over a few bills, and that was that. The room turned out to be just as I had imagined. Faded floral curtains, a sagging bed with a patchy quilt, and an old TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. There was a musty smell in the air, but honestly, I didn't care. I was too tired to complain. All I wanted was to get a few hours of sleep before heading back out on the road. I headed to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. The mirror was cracked, and the fluorescent light above flickered intermittently. As I stood there, letting the water run over my hands, I thought I heard something. Just a faint, rustling sound coming from outside the window. I paused, listening, but after a few seconds it stopped. I shook my head, brushing it off as the wind or some animal scurrying around outside. This was an old place. Creaks and weird noises were to be expected. I turned off the faucet and headed back into the room. I grabbed the remote and tried to turn on the TV, but after a few clicks, it was clear the thing was dead. Not that I was surprised. I tossed the remote aside and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, debating whether to just crash or maybe read something to unwind. That's when I heard it again, a soft, muffled sound, like whispering. At first, I thought it was coming from the room next door. Maybe someone else had checked in, and their voices were carrying through the thin walls. But when I pressed my ear against the wall, I realized something. There was no room next door. Room 6 was at the end of the row. There shouldn't have been anything but empty space on the other side of that wall. I pulled back, feeling a chill run through me. The whispering stopped. I tried to calm myself down. It was late. I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. That was all. But then the whispering started again. This time it was louder, closer, like it was coming from just outside the window. I stood up, my pulse racing as I stared at the thin, faded curtains. They were swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. I stepped toward the window. Slowly I reached out and pulled the curtain back. The parking lot was empty, no sign of anyone. I let out a shaky breath, trying to laugh off the wave of anxiety crashing over me. "You're losing it," I muttered to myself, letting the curtain fall back into place. I climbed into bed, pulling the thin quilt over me, and tried to get comfortable. But even as I lay there, I heard the faintest hint of whispering, just on the edge of my hearing, too soft to make out, but too persistent to ignore. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was catching the old building in weird ways, or maybe there was a draft coming from somewhere. I just needed to sleep, and everything would be fine in the morning. But I couldn't sleep. The whispering wouldn't stop. It got louder until it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was in the room. I shot up in bed, my heart racing now. The room was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was there, watching me. I fumbled for the lamp beside the bed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the switch. The light flickered on, casting the room in a dim, yellowish glow. There was no one there. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the empty room, trying to convince myself that I was alone. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 3:03 a.m. Why is it always 3 a.m.? I thought about leaving, just grabbing my stuff and driving off, but I was too tired. And what would I say? I'd paid for the room, and it wasn't like I could explain to the clerk that I was leaving because I felt weird. He'd probably think I was insane. So instead, I sat there, clutching the phone, waiting for morning. The whispering started again. Louder this time, clearer. It was saying my name. A chill shot through me. I sat motionless, staring at the window in shock. It was coming from outside again. Someone was out there, calling my name in a voice that wasn't quite human. I stood up slowly, my whole body trembling. I reached out, my hand shaking as I grabbed the edge of the fabric. Slowly I pulled it back, my heart pounding in my ears. There was nothing there, just the empty parking lot, bathed in the eerie glow of the flickering neon sign. But then, as I turned away, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the lot, just beyond the reach of the light. Tall, dark, featureless, watching me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. One blink, and the figure was no longer there. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. I didn't care what time it was. I didn't care if the clerk thought I was crazy. I just knew I had to get out of there. I threw open the door and ran across the lot to my car, and I sped out of there, not looking back. I didn't stop driving until the sun was up, the night far behind me. I don't know what I saw or what I heard that night at the Pine Creek Motel. All I know is that something was there, watching me, whispering my name. To this day, I still get chills whenever I pass by an old motel on the side of the road. I can't help but wonder, what if it wasn't just that place? What if whatever was out there that night is still following me? If these stories sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more horror stories that will keep you up at night. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next terrifying tale. Stay safe, and remember, some nightmares are real. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.